Good afternoon, everybody. How you all doing? Nothing like a good lunch sometimes, huh? All right. So we want to thank the Multicultural Affairs for providing the lunch and the space. So please put your hands together for that group. And today we're going to move with part 2. If you guys were here last week, we kind of tried to set the pace by using the content that Dr. King created to have this analysis of his words as a way to deal directly with what we call at the Black Studies Center, his legacy assassination. So if you were here last week, well, we weren't here. If you're with us last week and you use some of those quotes that Dr. King wrote, it shows a different light of him. It shows him in 1967 with this ominous atmosphere that he's made sure that his words were left behind so that we, in many ways, could come back today, deconstruct, decipher, and have a conversation about it. So we want to thank all our partners. Whammy's here. How about that? Put your hands together for Whammy. They're here. Kennedy King College out of Chicago, University of Washington's Whammy, Baltimore. Out of Baltimore, we have Morgan State's Urban Research Center. And I know that I'm missing someone, so please blame it on my head, not my heart. We want to move forward today, but I have a couple things that we need to clean up. We have a course shell, and we'll put that in the chat today. We have a course shell that we all want everybody to join, and we will begin to have conversations in between now and next week about what you think about the presentations and then Dr. King's legacy. So we'll use that. Also, we want to make sure that while you're here, you do your best to become involved during the question and answer. So Dr. Christina Rivers out of DePaul University, a political scientist extraordinaire who teaches this text in her course. I guarantee, and I rest assured, she'll be able to handle the questions. So dig down deep, create the questions. And again, I want to introduce Dr. Christina Rivers from DePaul University. We are so glad to have you, Doc. And I know you're out of the country, but you're the closest thing I get to Chicago today. So that being the case, we want you to take it from here. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Dixon. Thank you to the University of Wyoming for inviting me to speak as part of your university's Martin Luther King Week events. It is an honor to be here, even if only virtually and from far, far away on the other side of the Atlantic. And I'm glad, even though I'm sorry that the video part isn't working, but it's actually good to be talking to you now that I could put my fuzzy robe back on because the place I'm staying is really chilly. So I won't be sitting here shivering as we're talking. So although I'm on a sabbatical leave right now here and have escaped the US for a while, and I've been gleefully ignoring most of my email, but I was really excited to see Dr. Dixon's invitation to speak on this book, Where Do We Go From Here? And on these particular chapters as well. There's some of my favorite chapters and writings by King. So I'm really honored to be able to talk about that here. So I hope you find my comments thoughtful, and I look forward to discussing all of this afterwards. So the first thing I want to talk about is these three veils. And I'm going to explain my play on words borrowing from W.E.B. Du Bois here. And can people see the second slide? Everybody's looking at the same thing. It says three veils. Great. I see you nodding your head in the background. Thank you. So I'm homing in on these three particular veils that obscure his legacies because they're issues that come up so much in my classes from my own students. And I've been teaching this class now for about 20 years. And it also, tends to come up in some popular discussions, tends to come up in media. It tends to come up in some scholarly coverage of Dr. King. So there are a lot more veils that obscure his legacies, but I sort of just picked the top three. And before I really go deep into this, I want to give you some context, which also I think leads to some of this veiling. I had never heard of this book I had to go through my own process of discovery. I had never heard of this book, had never had it assigned until I had it in graduate school. It was assigned to me during a directed reading by Dr. Turner, who was chairing Cornell's Africana Studies and Research Center at the time. This was the mid-90s, I'll date myself. And so I'll always be grateful to Dr. Turner for his introducing me to this book and to many other great works. But I gotta say, I was frustrated that I had never heard of it. So the first chance I had to design my own course while in graduate school, I assigned chapters, Dr. Dixon, you'll like this, 2 through 4 of this book because it had so resonated with me. And I immediately heard similar frustrations from my students. They were first-year students at the time, that they had never heard of it. This was 20 years after I had been, 15 years after I had been a freshman. And so I took their frustration to heart that they had never really heard of it. There was also frustration when I learned that the book had been out of print for decades. There was frustration at even trying to assign this work when it comes to copyright fees. This is back in the good old days or bad old days of instructors making Xerox copies of readings for students. And it was very disturbing that simply to add one chapter of this book to the reading packet would have almost doubled the price of the reading packet, which was, to me, mind-blowing. So let's just say I might have bent a few copyright laws to teach this course. I just went and copied the stuff for myself. I hope there's a statute of limitations on this, and I know I'm being recorded, but I will deny this anyway. But yeah, I was stunned that there was a copyright limitation on this book. In my mind, this was something that should, and I thought was just in the general domain. Of course, I was frustrated at the political and ideological sterilizing of King's legacy, which is what I'm most going to concentrate on today. And I still hear the frustrations of students now, over a decade later, who still have not heard of this book, even though more has come out on King. So I'm very glad that this book is now back in print. It was reissued along with all of his other books, I think about 12 years ago, so I can teach the course correctly. And I'm really glad that these really powerful aspects of King's legacy are finally getting their due. I should say that I'm far from an expert on King. He wrote a lot, he spoke a lot. But again, I do assign this and 3 others of his books in a course that I teach. In these 2 chapters again, and several other courses. So these are really core foundational courses, and it's why I'm so glad to be speaking on them. And again, these 3 perceptions that I have up here are really what I'm drawing from the class. One other thing I want to add is I'm using this term, the veil, borrowing from W.E.B. Du Bois's 1903 concept of the veil, which illustrates, he described as illustrating the way that racism and willful ignorance have functioned to shroud the Black psyche, the Black collective, Black history, and Black empowerment. So I'm going to argue today that King has been veiled in way more ways than what's listed here, and that this veiling has really led to some very problematic policy and political outcomes. And so this call is, this talk, my talk, and I think this week is a call to unveil the full range of King's thoughts with warning. So the risk of unveiling, pulling all these shrouds off of King's legacy is that in doing so, it will knock him off of the pedestal that so many people who have veiled him have put him on. But in my mind, that's a necessary risk. If we want to honestly honor King's legacy, given that so many who have put him on that pedestal have put him on the wrong pedestal for the wrong reasons that are largely derived from sort of veiling over the aspects of King that I'm going to talk about. So again, often my students will say, oh, King we think he was an apologist. He was too easy on these folks that he was dealing with in the Jim Crow South. Many of my students express frustration that in their minds, he was passive. They don't have a lot of resonance with the sort of turn your other cheek ideology that King is associated with. They see him as being too patient. This third veil is one that happens more in the area of public policy, and particularly on the Supreme Court and amongst legislators, that color blindness is incompatible with race consciousness. These are all myths. And so the next few slides I'm going to show here are going to be a content analysis. So it sounds like you saw some of his words in the last talk. You're going to see a lot more words in this talk, and then we'll go through those hopefully by the end of my talk. So what I've done here, and hopefully you all can read this, this is big enough. And I'm not going to read this to you, trust me, I'm not going to be that person. But again, I've chosen some of these quotations that to me really challenge these three veils. So the question about, is he an apologist? And you can read these and conclude for yourself whether he is. And again, I've just pulled key points from these two chapters. Key points is a trick statement, because in this particular book, I would argue more than in even Why We Can't Wait, almost every point he makes in these chapters really stands out on its own. So it's hard to glean out key points. There are just so many. But I really want to emphasize here a couple of things. King talks about the mutuality of the oppressor and the oppressed. His points here have been construed by some, including a lot of my students, as a concession to white supremacism. I can kind of see that at first glance, but I want to argue that there's much more to King's concept of mutuality. Some have dismissed King's discussion of mutuality as this rehash of Booker T. Washington's famous or infamous, if you will, 5 fingers of the hand speech. Booker T. Washington gave this speech back in 1895 to Southern white leaders, segregationists in 1895, that described the relationship between Blacks and whites as interdependent as our 5 fingers of the same hand. But in that speech, he did not challenge white supremacism, and he emphasized how desegregation would benefit whites primarily, and that Blacks would sort of essentially benefit from desegregation by default, sort of this rising tide lifts all boats approach. There was no hint of egalitarianism in Booker T. Washington's speech. King's concept of racial interdependence, I argue, is more egalitarian, as you can see here. It's a more assertive twist on Washington's points. Now, that's not surprising. It's a different time. It's a somewhat different audience, this book. He's not just speaking to white Southern segregationists. He's speaking to Americans across the board, and primarily to Northern, I should say, liberals outside of the South. And so different time, different audiences dictate different approaches to this argument that Blacks and whites ultimately had equally linked fates, to use the term of political scientist Michael Dawson. I'm not sure Michael Dawson would agree with my using his term this way, but I'm going to run with it because he's not in the room. And I think it fits. So it's, again, King here is invoking this mutuality in a more egalitarian way, whereas Booker T. Washington's invocation of interdependence was much more subordinate and conceded, at least on the surface, to segregation in the South in 1895. And so we'll move on to the next slide, which is more on apologism. Oops, just hit the wrong button. From chapter 4, I've sort of paired these comments. Why isn't this? Hold on a minute. Well, that's interesting. Oh no, I didn't mean to do that. Sorry, folks. I don't know why. Huh. Okay, let me try to re-screen share. That just crashed on me. So hang on a minute. I'm going to turn off my volume for a minute. Okay, can people see that?
We can.
Okay. There we go. I'm sorry, I don't know what happened. That might have been a weird thing on my connection, but we're seeing the slide that should say an apologist continued. Is that what you're seeing? It says chapter 4.
Yes, we are.
Perfect, thank you. And right now I can't see you all anymore. So if you want to interact with me, you'll just have to yell. There, okay, there you are. Okay, that little tiny thumbnail. Okay, so King continues in chapter 4 with his revision of Washington's argument, Five Fingers argument. But again, he's further putting White's feet to the fire here. And this is something that Booker T. Washington did not do. I'm emphasizing this analogy between King and Booker T. Washington because I'm pretty clear that King was framed around a lot of Booker T. Washington's thinking. A lot of Southern Black leaders were. But he's too often equated with another Booker T. Washington, who by the 60s was seen as too conciliatory. And I really wanted to point out that there's a difference between King and Washington, even though, again, I'm sure he grew up in the context of Washington's thought and its sort of enduring leadership. So again, Washington framed his arguments in a very dependent hierarchical way, while King's framing of interdependence were much more interdependent and equal, all fingers being equally necessary and symbiotic. King's legacy has been stripped of his more confrontational words here, and I think that contributes to this false critique of him as too conciliatory. In his earlier books, King detailed, getting to this description where he talks about detailing the brutalities of chattel slavery. King has done this before. In his earlier books, he's detailed the pain and hypocrisies of Jim Crow segregation and of white supremacism. So, for example, the opening chapters in his first book, Stride Toward Freedom, the famous letter from Birmingham jail, which so many people have read, in his book, Why We Can't Wait, really emphasizes the horrors and the pain of Jim Crow segregation. Here, he's taking it further back historically and detailing the pain and hypocrisies of chattel slavery and white supremacism. He has a similar discussion and recitation of these horrors in chapter 3, so he's really emphasizing this. And he also places his I Have a Dream speech in the context of the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation and what more needed to be done. So these are all examples of the extent to which King's writing are very historically contextualized, and how even that contextualization has been sort of stripped away from his legacy. Much of his thought is deeply historically contextualized, again, much like early critical race theory, particularly the work of Derek Bell, Cheryl Harris, Neil Gatanda, and Gary Peller. So King is not apologizing for racists. In my interpretation, at least, he's demanding atonement from them and from the liberals who tolerate them. Again, by 1967, when he published this book, he was really addressing liberals who, in his mind, their support of the civil rights movement was insufficient. It was good, but insufficient. It was tepid. It needed to be fired up. This aspect of King really holding not only segregationists accountable, but for liberals who have tolerated that segregationism, that's been very heavily veiled. That aspect of King has been very heavily veiled. So the next slide here gets at this question of, is he too passive? Is he too patient? It's clear in this book that he is getting very impatient. And he doesn't seem to sugarcoat that very much. So the tone that he takes in chapters 3 and 4 here, again, invoke Frederick Douglass. Both he and Frederick Douglass relied on this concept of what they call moral suasion. In Douglass's case, it was to abolish chattel slavery. King certainly employed some of this and believed in this notion of moral slavery, really appealing to people's morals. But both King and Douglass realized that moral suasion alone are not sufficient for Black liberty and equality. Urgency is also necessary. They both recognize that waiting patiently for those in power to cede some of that power on their own is futile. So if you even think of the title of one of his earlier books, Why We Can't Wait, the title itself invokes this sense of urgency. The title itself challenges white liberal recommendations of simply letting time take its course towards equality. Another example of this in the I Have a Dream speech is a phrase that he repeated frequently in that speech about the fierce urgency of now. And so this veiling, this idea of King as sort of this hurry up and wait type of person is inaccurate, and his wording here really proves that point. I do want to point out that it's important to understand his distinctions between pacifism and passivity or passiveness. They're very different. He doesn't go into detail about those distinctions and where do we go from here. He does go into detail about those distinctions in his first book, Stride Towards Freedom. And it's very, very important to understand that pacifism, which is the grounding of his nonviolent resistance, is not the same as passivity. So often my students, I think when they're describing him as passive, what they may be getting at is pacifistic, but they're conflating those two different terms. I think another reason for some of, he did have a more deliberate approach early on in the 1950s when he really was hitting his stride. There were reasons for that. 1955 was the beginning of the modern civil rights movement. Much of what that movement was doing was untested with, of course, deadly potential. There were fewer results from that movement at that point. By 1967, 68, much bigger changes had been happening and were in progress. The Civil Rights Act at that point had been passed in 64. The Voting Rights Act had been passed in 65. These were massive successes. But the pace of change after those acts were passed did strike people as being rather slow, not just King, but a lot of folks. And so King, I think on some level was starting to worry that change was going to be incremental and would just result in tokenism and not really go further than that. And I would argue that some of those fears have been realized. Also, the civil rights movement by the mid to late 60s, 67 or so was expanding more nationally. It was morphing as well into a Black Power movement, which took on a much more assertive tone. And finally, King was very upset, incensed really, at President Johnson's acceleration of the Vietnam War at expense of the civil rights policies that were to be put into effect by the Civil Rights Act. And so that last piece also really informed, I think, and put the fire under his feet more so in terms of his sense of urgency. So the next, and I think last set of misinterpretations, and I really packed this slide because there's so many points to choose from here in this book. And this is, I think, his most important veiling that needs to be stripped away, is the misperception that King is averse to race-conscious thought and remedies. And I'm just here to say, and King said it in these two chapters, he is absolutely not averse to race-conscious thought and remedies, not by any stretch. And you would have to completely lie about his legacy to conclude that he was averse to race-conscious thought and remedies to racial inequality. Again, I've included more quotes here because this part of him, in my opinion at least, has been the most misunderstood and has been twisted around to really undermine his legacy. It's not a matter of him just being misunderstood. His legacy has been undermined on this particular point. So we first see that King makes it clear that not only is he not averse to race consciousness, he affirms Blackness, he affirms Black pride. This is a continuation of some of the points he made in chapter 2 that you all learned about last week. He makes important distinctions between race consciousness and racism. Again, those are not the same. And these distinctions have been completely contorted since then by both liberals and conservatives. You can see that he not only supports, but he actually proposes race-based remedies to racist problems. As he articulates in chapter 2, Martin Luther King may have issues with the slogan Black Power, but he supports the concept of Black empowerment. Again, those are two different things. So these are some of his most forcefully race-conscious points, but they're not even the first time he's made them, actually, not by far. And so in the book, Why We Can't Wait, he has a very important discussion of tokenism and the fears, again, that colorblindness on its own could just lead to tokenism, which is really not progress towards racial equality. It's just sort of symbolic equality. And in Why We Can't Wait, he has a vigorous endorsement of, in particular, racial bloc voting. And he talks about that in more than one spot in that particular book. I have read scholarly articles that invoke that book to oppose race-conscious remedies and to oppose racial bloc voting. And so I have to ask myself, how much of that book do the people invoking it actually read? And even in his I Have a Dream speech, the first third of that speech, if you really read it and listen to it, it's about reparations. And he employs this language: America issued Blacks a bad check, a bad promissory note, it's defaulted on its debt. There's a lot of analogies along those lines in the first section or first third of the I Have a Dream speech. So that is continued into Where Do We Go From Here, but much more intensified. And, again, this is from chapter 3, now chapter 4, very similar. So I would say the gist here is that Martin Luther King, again, not only supported, but he proposed and went into detail in some of these proposals. He proposed race-conscious remedies to overcome and prevent racial discrimination. For King, colorblindness was important, it was significant, it was valuable, but it was a means to an end. Colorblindness was not in and of itself the end goal. So one cannot honestly invoke Martin Luther King to undermine or overturn race-conscious policies, which would include policies like affirmative action. They can't do this honestly. To do so, and this has been done often, folks have invoked Martin Luther King to undermine or overturn race-conscious policies, but to do so betrays King's words, it defiles his words and his deeds and his dreams. And that aspect of his legacy, again, I think is the part that's become the most contorted. And so some of the impacts of veiling and contorting these legacies and these philosophies of his are, and this is just sort of a quick list here. Again, there's more than on this list. But by veiling his legacy, and particularly his openness to race consciousness, you do end up with incrementalism, which is related to tokenism, right? A good example is Brown versus Board of Education. It was a major decision, but it was not enforced. You then had Brown versus Board 2, which was decided, I think, the next year in 1955, where the court basically said that Brown versus Board needed to be implemented with all deliberate speed. And the phrase all deliberate speed is itself an oxymoron when you think about it, in terms of desegregating schools. And I often have, we read the headlines in newspaper articles and scholarly studies that segregation, racial segregation in some areas of the country now is worse than it was in Jim Crow South. Diversity is still lagging in many professions, especially at top management levels of professions. Political diversity is still lagging. And so lagging diversity does keep us at this stage of tokenism. It still does. Affirmative action and race-conscious policies that came out of the civil rights movement were not intended to create or stop at tokenism. But in some cases, that's still where we are. You note how many firsts we still read about in terms of the first African-American or the first Native American, you name it, who were doing things. These are firsts should be celebrated, but it's also a reminder that 60 years after the civil rights movement, these firsts are still happening. Veiling the legacy also leads to censorship. We're at a point now, and right now the target is critical race theory, but there's again a resurgence in censorship related to teaching, and in some cases even talking about diversity, critical race theory, even history, because so much of critical race theory is history. It's looking at legal history, but it's very historicized. This is a dangerous result of defining colorblindness in a way that precludes acknowledging or even talking about race or difference. Not being able to talk about race defangs the 14th Amendment, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and similar legislation. And worse, it allows racial discrimination and inequality to continue, even in the absence of the sort of foaming at the mouth Jim Crow vitriol. but it does allow racial discrimination and inequality to continue. So what it leads to is what sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva refers to as racism without racist. You know, we have stereotypes in our minds of what a racist sounds like or looks like. But racism itself is not always in your face visible. In more recent years, I would say that this veiling has helped or contributed to promoting more unbridled racism, that sort of old school unbridled racism. This is all really crucial, in particular, when we look at the Supreme Court. And I'm going to bore you a little bit with to discuss some of these cases that the Supreme Court is currently hearing, because they're really important. And I also want to talk a little bit about some of their preceding or earlier decisions or statements that are really echoing and emblematic of this colorblind racism or racism without racist that comes from stripping the civil rights movement legacy and King's legacy of its endorsement of race-conscious remedies to racial discrimination. So Chief Justice Roberts, in a school desegregation case in 2007, concluded his opinion by saying that the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. It's a really stunning oversimplification of the problem. And as many of you may have discovered on some of your papers, if you were to write a circular statement like that in some of your papers, your instructors probably called you out on that because there's really no logic to that statement. Justice Thomas decontextualized Frederick Douglass's recommendation that the government leave Blacks alone. Frederick Douglass was saying this back in the 1800s to argue against affirmative action in a 2006 decision. Justice O'Connor's hugely misinformed equation of the use of race to draw more racially balanced electoral districts, equating that with the use of race to oppress voters. She made this mis-equation in 1993. These are all baked into this falsely colorblind notion of the civil rights movement and this sort of falsely colorblind legacy of Martin Luther King. And in some cases, again, they're even invoking his words. So this type of veiling the legacy, or this aspect of veiling the legacy, has some really problematic and very pervasive outcomes. The Supreme Court, I bring these examples up in particular because the Supreme Court is currently hearing, I think it's heard 2 so far, 3 cases right now on voting rights, or 2 cases on voting rights, and 1 on affirmative action. And you can count on them invoking this same veiled concept of equality and colorblindness, again, which really contorts King's legacy here. And this is one reason it was so significant that the newest Supreme Court Justice, Brown Jackson, why it's so significant that she made the points that she made during oral arguments last week about what the original intent of the 14th Amendment was. And so I can go into more detail about that later on, but I just want to point out that I think Justice Brown Jackson may be setting the stage to really challenge her fellow justices on some of this colorblind constitutionalism that has been used in a way that completely precludes race consciousness, where again, many of them rely on a partial understanding of Martin Luther King. At the end of the day, what this also does is it degrades the core American value of equality if it hampers legislation to sort of more of a tokenistic or impartial implementation, if it hampers that dream, that full dream that King had talked about back in 1963. And so King comes, again, he's got deep historical roots. I'm going to run through these really, really quickly. He doesn't always mention these folks. But some of the names that I have here are folks who would have been described as, I put abolitionists, but really they often have been described as radical abolitionists, militant in some cases. David Walker, for example, Henry Highland Garnett, Martin Delany. These were very militant abolitionists that most people would not connect to King. But in terms of their concept of equality and really asserting in very race-conscious ways that Blacks are in fact equal to whites, King's legacy, King's writing falls completely within that tradition. The big difference is some of these abolitionists took a more assertive approach towards ending slavery, and King, like Frederick Douglass, was completely and solely subscribed to a form of nonviolent resistance. But King fully falls and connects up with some of these leaders that I've got listed here, all of whom were leaders in the 18th century and some in the early 19th century. King, of course, was also sort of being buffeted about between the perils of Jim Crow, the hopes of the Brown versus Board of Education decision, even though it was sort of an incomplete overturning of Plessy versus Ferguson, and then this new Black Power movement, which was so different in so many ways from the civil rights movement. And so this book was being written in between those sort of last 3 points, which was really kind of would shake him back and forth ideologically. And so with that, I will end with 2 challenges from where do we go from here? It's hard for me to choose a favorite quote from this book, but if I had to do it, I would really say that the second challenge from chapter 4, let us therefore not think of our movement as one that seeks to integrate the Negro into all the existing values of society, American society. Let us be those creative dissenters who will call our beloved nation to a higher destiny, to a new plateau of compassion, and to a more noble expression of humaneness. So I will end by challenging us all to think about how we can do that, and also with another one of his much more famous quotations, which is that the time is always right to do what is right. And so on that note, I am done because I've said enough. I will stop my screen share and I'll take questions if people have any.
All right, Doc, thank you so much. Your candidness and the way that it was very concise helps this room because we're in here packed. And
Oh, good.
it has really worked out thus far. But for anyone who has questions, gather those up now, but I'm going to begin with one. So Doc, when we think about the symbolic connection to Dr. King and contemporary 2002 mindsets that are scattered in this ubiquitous misunderstanding of humaneness, as he says, what do you think about chapter 3 and chapter 4's title? How does he tie that? And is this some sort of clairvoyant way that Dr. King is connected to what we're going through today in your thought?
Well, the cynic in me, the phrase, the more things change, the more they stay the same comes to mind, because it is chilling to be teaching this text now for 20 years. And in many ways, chapter 4, I think, is more relevant than it's been since he wrote it. The world is a different place, the US is a different place, and expressions of racial animosity have always been around, but they really intensified in the past 10 or so years. More than that, they really started to peak up when Barack Obama was elected, particularly at a national level. I think prior to that, you would have pockets of it in different parts of the country, but it became very nationalized around that same time, which many people sort of predicted. And then, it got worse in subsequent years. So this is the pervasiveness of the hostility, not just against Black folks, but particularly against Black folks, is something that I, in my 60 years of existence, have not witnessed before. And I grew up in the civil rights movement. Granted, I was a kid, but you hear about it, you hear the grown folks talking about it. I was steeped in it. I don't have any conscious memory of quite the level of hostility until now. And so I think that makes chapter 4 very, very relevant. And, he really comes out swinging in that chapter. And, he uses words like delusions and schizophrenia. He's really framing racism as a form of a mental illness, which others have done. This is not language that he's used in his previous books. He was holding back in a lot of his previous writing. And so I think it makes it more important that more people read this particular work. And I would say these 3 chapters combined, 2, 3, and 4. But, again, on the flip side, like I said, if more people read this, he may lose some of his fan club, right? Because he's got so much of a fan club that is built on this false perception of really what he was about.
Questions, anyone? Go right ahead, Ian.
How can I in modern day prevent this daily happening? Civil rights leaders now are advocating for change right now.
Did you hear that, Dr. Rivers?
It was a little broken up. Can you repeat it?
How can I in modern day prevent sort of
I'm hearing even less now.
He says, how can he in the modern day prevent this sort of veiling, particularly for those who are active in the liberation struggle today?
I think that it's one of those things where you almost want to just give the book away, right? Anytime you hear somebody kind of going into this traditional interpretation of Martin Luther King, which is the very dominant interpretation of Martin Luther King, so you're going to hear it all the time. You're going to hear it all the time. Just, mention, hey, have you read his stuff? And just suggest, read these particular books, read these particular chapters. Again, these 3 chapters, 2, 3, and 4, just point them to those particular chapters. Point them, I think it's to chapter 8, I would say, and Why We Can't Wait. They don't have to read the whole book if they don't want to. The other thing I would do is really point people back to the I Have a Dream speech, because now I'm only seeing a corner of the audience, but if I asked you how many of you have heard or been required to read or listen to I Have a Dream, I think all of your hands would probably go up, right? Because it's become sort of standard part and parcel in high school curricula. But when I say read and listen, I mean, really, I would say read it. I think it's words sink in some ways better if you're just kind of staring at it for a minute. So I'm going to go back to years ago. Michael Eric Dyson published a book that was sort of a retrospective analysis on King's legacy. And he got into some of this as well, called I May Not Get There With You. And for those of you who are familiar with Michael Eric Dyson, he likes controversy, right? He likes to put stuff out there that just kind of has you stop and take a breath, right? And so he made this assessment, with which I completely agree, that King's legacy has been boiled down to, I think, the 37 words of the one phrase in the I Have a Dream speech, which is about the content of your character. In the last part of I Have a Dream, he goes on, he has this litany of dreams. He mentions about 7 dreams, I think, and the content of your character was one of 7 dreams that he had. And these followed another litany of demands where it was much more urgent, right? And so Michael Eric Dyson rightly, I think, argues that this speech has been used to water King down. And so he proposed, being typical Michael Eric Dyson, that we put a moratorium on the I Have a Dream speech, and this will, and then encourage us to read other things that he's written or listen to his other speeches. So I agree with half of that. I obviously would encourage people to readable. He's easily readable. The words flow off the page. He doesn't write like us political scientists, which will put you to sleep. But I disagree with putting I Have a Dream on a moratorium. I would do the reverse and say, let's actually read I Have a Dream, because there's 3 parts of it. The first part, it's about reparations. He doesn't use the R word, but when you're talking about, we are here to cash a bad check or to make good on this bad check, to hold America to account for this bad promissory note. We're talking about reparations here. And he didn't use the word reparations because reparations hadn't become the thing, right? That idea, that concept hadn't become the thing at the time that it is now, the word. But this is really what he's getting at. The second part of I Have a Dream, he's talking about the urgency, again, why we can't wait. And he's almost predicting that if leaders continue with this sort of hurry up and wait, time will take care of this on its own, that something bad is really going to happen. And he doesn't threaten that, but he predicts it. Again, there's a difference between threatening something and predicting something. It's really consequential that he goes in that direction in the second part of the speech. Again, Frederick Douglass has done this in his 4th of July speech. David Walker did this in his appeal, David Walker's appeal. Thomas Jefferson did this in a very introspective way in his notes on the state of Virginia, right? Recognizing that the system of chattel slavery was probably going to bring down divine wrath at some point. This is all on the record, right? So I would encourage people to really dig into that speech, whether it's through listening to it or whether it's through reading it, and really appreciating those 3 pieces. So there's the reparations piece, what America owes the US. There's this urgency piece that's in the middle, where he's saying if something doesn't change, things could get a lot worse. And then he gets to the dreams and the aspirations. And so the speech has been boiled down to that much more aspirational speech part of it. I'm sorry, much more aspirational part, because it's much more positive, right? And then again, boiled down into that one little frame. I think if more people really engage that whole speech, they would get a much better sense of what he's about. I would also, many people are required to read Letter from Birmingham Jail. It's beautiful. But again, it does, in some ways, come across in a more plaintive tone, I should say, although he is holding religious leaders very much to account. But again, I would encourage people to read more towards the end of that book, particularly, I think it's chapter 8. I don't have it in front of me. I don't have any of these books in front of me because I'm out of the country. But I would encourage, again, those 3 sources, the I Have a Dream speech, chapters 2, 3, and 4, from Where Do We Go From Here, chapter 8 of Why We Can't Wait, and become familiar with them yourself so that you can sort of spout this stuff out. You know, I would say a 4th really good example for people to familiarize themselves with is his speech that he gave at Riverside Church, A Time to Break the Silence, where he really forcefully came out against the Vietnam War, where he also talked a lot about domestic problems in the US. And it's really what kind of took him off the map, you know, got him off the cover of Time. He caught a lot of flack for that speech, but it's really, that speech I think is really where he was heading. And you can really see where he was taking a much more assertive and aggressive tone towards inequality. So it's a long answer, but that's where I would go with that.
I think it's very interesting that you mentioned the I Have a Dream speech and Dr. King chastening and chastising America to say that he can't believe that America has insufficient funds. Mm-hmm. So I think that in that, it's a power to not read that part of the speech. It's a power to not discuss it in the classroom. So Absolutely. I think Dr. Rivers, in many ways, you could read the speech, depends on who's teaching it, and never get to it.
Yes. And I think what ends up happening is when I've asked my students, you know, when you all cover this speech in class, how do you cover it? Now, these are first-year students, and so they're speaking of their high school classes, right? But they either say they have to watch it, and then they have a few maybe generic questions that the instructor asks, or sometimes they just hear or listen to, they're assigned to hear or listen to that last part. So what I'm learning is the way it's taught is very incomplete and very sanitized. And it's not done in a very thoughtful way. Now, again, you know, if you're writing a curriculum to address 7th graders or 12th graders or 11th graders, attention spans are different, right? But that doesn't mean that folks that age can't pay attention. And then, you know, if you take a college class where you're, you know, sort of assigned to delve deeper into it, that's great. But not everybody does that. Not everybody goes to college. And when people go to college, not everybody takes a class on Martin Luther King. But, you know, I would say to start by really rediscovering that speech is probably the best way to start, because it really does encapsulate his urgency, even though it was in 63 as opposed to 67 when he wrote this book, and the urgency was more on the surface, because it's there. It's very there if you really read it. And it's a short read, right? It's 4 pages, I think, of a speech. So it's not even a chapter length. And I think the actual speech is maybe 45 minutes or something like that. So I would start with that, because it really does encapsulate a lot.
I think it goes back to the power dynamic there that is being erased sometimes when that is taught, or when it's not taught by someone who's productive enough and has the fortitude to dig down into it. Like today, when we think about diversity and diversity, equity, and inclusion, and those trainings and those things that embody diversity, equity, inclusion, it's quite easy and also par for the course to have folks who create and craft these DEI departments and programs to really have not dealt with or just be staunch racists themselves.
Yeah,
so that's pretty interesting.
I've been to some really, I've been at some very watered down DEI presentations. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, we right here at the University of Wyoming are looking for another DEI professional. I think the irony of all that is the same. Some of the same folks created this space where we had the last person who's not here are on that particular search. So not much has changed, but I guess there's some sort of optics that comes with it.
Dr. Rivers, I, like a lot of people my age, critical race theory in graduate school. But the propaganda machine has reduced it to sort of a cartoon dog whistle. Do you see any way that the core ideas behind critical race theory can be rehabilitated in public discourse?
So I heard the last part. Do I see any ways that the core ideas of critical race theory can be rehabilitated into the discourse? Did I hear you correctly?
Yes.
Okay, the first part of that question was was muffled. So if there was another question there, I didn't hear it. But I can take on the second part. You know, it's tough because critical race theory at this point has been so incredibly demonized. And it was controversial out of the gates, right? But in recent years, it has been so incredibly demonized that it's hard, it's a hot potato. It's hard to even bring it up without scaring people off, or in some cases even, I don't know, insulting people, offending people. I'm going to give you a really simplistic answer to this. This is my approach to it. When it comes up is, you know, I often just say critical race theory is what it is. And to me, critical race theory is legal history that takes race into account. Critical race theory is a race-conscious interpretation of the Constitution, particularly the 14th Amendment, because as Justice Brown Jackson pointed out last week, the 14th Amendment, the framing debates, the ratification of it was completely steeped in race, and not race broadly, but in the black-white binary. It was very narrowly steeped in the black-white binary because it was a follow-up to the 13th Amendment, and it was a follow-up to the Civil War, which was a very black-white binary. Over time, the 14th Amendment has been expanded to provide an umbrella of protections over many other groups who have also been oppressed, horrifically oppressed. But the original, to engage in critical race theory is to really restore the factual racial context of the framing of the 14th Amendment. So it really does interrogate this notion of originalism. And so some of what I read, some of the analyses that I read last week of Justice Jackson Brown's comments were that, you know, it's a new twist on originalism, and not to take away from her at all, because I'm so glad she made this point and that she belabored that point, but it's not a new take on originalism. It's critical race theory, at least early critical race theory as it emerged in the late 80s and I would say early 90s. And so some of the names that I mentioned earlier, writers such as Cheryl Harris, Neil Gotanda, Gary Peller, they talk about this, that they really kind of go into the race conscious framing of not just the 14th Amendment, but the Civil War amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th. That's undeniable. I have read the congressional record around the 14th Amendment. It is decidedly race conscious. How could it not be? And so to be able to strip the framers' intent, strip racial considerations from the framers' intent is really a magical act, because it's impossible. The framing of the 14th Amendment was steeped in race and in this black-white binary. It's there. Anybody can go read it. These days, the congressional record is online. I had to stand in a basement and copy it off for many weeks, but it's there. And that's what Justice Brown Jackson was getting at. Critical race theory over time, as it expanded rights, as it expanded its purview, and it looked at rights, having to do with gender and sexuality and ethnicity and other races, became also more critical, right? But at its base, critical race theory is about recognizing and incorporating a race conscious interpretation into judicial interpretations of the 14th Amendment. I may be oversimplifying it, but to me, that's the anchor of critical race theory. And you have conservatives who are terrified of that, and you have liberals who are terrified of that. And I think part of the reason is because race consciousness has so often been equated with racism, and it's not the same thing. Racism is a form of race consciousness. It's an oppressive form of race consciousness, but you can also have an ameliorative, a remedial form of race consciousness, which is what King gets at here in chapters 3 and 4. And in other aspects, in others of his writing that I had mentioned earlier. So that's, again, I think to really simplify critical race theory is, again, it's restoring the reality that of the racial context of the framing and the framers' intent for the 14th Amendment. I would also add that the first two opportunities that the Supreme Court had to interpret the 14th Amendment, their interpretation of the 14th Amendment in two cases in the 1870s was extremely limited and extremely race conscious. Those cases, those opinions have not been formally overturned, but they've been just completely ignored. But the two very first interpretations that the court gave to the 14th Amendment were decidedly, unambiguously race conscious, and not just race conscious, but narrowly interpreting the 14th Amendment to apply to freed, formerly enslaved people. So it's a very different interpretation of what we have now.
Okay, well, Dr. Rivers, I think about further simplifying critical race theory and thinking about the 13th Amendment, not the supposed abolishment of slavery, but the exception clause,
right?
That in itself says what? You cannot be held in servitude unless you are convicted of committing a crime. That in itself is critical race theory. So many folks talk about America and critical race theory. Well, what critical race theory will say is that America is a settler, colonial, criminal colony. And we have never got to that in a way that challenges that. So when critical race theory talks about race, it's the fact that we have never gotten to the problematic issues of race that makes critical race theory so very put off by many and scare the hell out of some others. So thank you for that.
And delivery is everything, right? And there are some people who write about critical race theory where, they're throwing everything out there. There are other folks who write about critical race theory in ways that are not as confrontational, but that are still making the point. One of the most effective or interesting ways of talking about critical race theory, and I forgot to mention him, was Derek Bell. And he was a law professor for many years at Harvard, and kind of considered one of the fathers of critical race theory. And he engaged, there's a part of critical race theory that is, what's the word I'm looking for? allegorical. They sort of engage in stories, right? Because there's a recognition that storytelling can be a really effective way to make the point in every bit as assertively, but in ways that gets the listener to thinking more about it, right? So Derek Bell has a couple of books, Faces at the Bottom of the Well, and I forget the name of the other one, where it's a series of fictitious discussions with him and sort of a muse, this woman who's like a muse, Geneva, I think is her name. And she's his talking point. And it's almost like he's talking to himself, but he's talking to her. And Geneva interrogates him with these questions about the meaning of race in the Constitution, the meaning of race in America's history, the meaning of race in contemporary times. But it's done in this kind of storytelling, conversational way, but it's talking about the law. And it's really a very interesting way to think about this, to kind of pull back a little bit. And if your hackles get up, right, and you feel your shoulders kind of tensing up, it's a thoughtful, really thoughtful way of just pulling back and thinking about what it is he's talking about. So yeah, there's a whole offshoot of critical race theory that really engages in this sort of, and the right word isn't coming to mind, but it's almost like parables, right? And it's also a riff. I have not gone to law school. I fake it. I teach a couple law classes, but I'm one of those professors that fakes it, right? I've taken law classes, but I don't have the JD. But I think these parables and these allegories that Derek Bell is so good at, and there's a couple of other critical race theories who write like this as well, and I just can't think of their names because I'm not sitting in front of my bookcase. But I think this method of getting people to thinking about this is also a riff off of hypotheticals that people do in law school, that instructors do engage in. And so, I've been in these sessions, I've witnessed them, I haven't participated, and they're fascinating, where, the instructor comes in and they just say, okay, here's a hypothetical. XYZ does this, plaintiff does this, blah, blah, blah. And they give you this hypothetical case. And then they say, okay, think about this as from the perspective of the plaintiff. Think about this from the perspective of the defendant. What would you do? What would you argue? And anytime, and they'll call on a student and the student says something, and then the instructor adds another layer and then another layer. And it's all hypothetical, right? And it's a fascinating way for law students to really think through how would they argue the law in front of a judge. And so to me, Derek Bell's allegories and parables is a different way of engaging in these hypothetical scenarios that pretty much every law student engages in. So that's my guess as well. It's a way to make it just makes it different.
Cindy, if you could put your question in the chat, we'll try to get to it. Do we have any others? Okay. Want to try to give Cindy just a minute.
Okay.
But Doc, we want to thank you for coming out. We really appreciate it. And to look at it now through the lens of almost 3/4 of the book we've already completed. And we look forward to Dr. Claybrook from the University of California State, Long Beach next week. You have done us a great favor as usual. And I want to give Cindy some time, but we want to thank you, Doc. Anything in closing?
I just want to commend you for featuring this particular book.
How about all this going on in Wyoming, Doc? What you think about that?
And now you need to hit me, because I have been blissfully ignorant of a lot of stuff that's going on in my home country. So you need to hit me to what's happening in Wyoming. Give me the detail. I'm sorry, I've got broad swaths, but update me.
Well, I mean, just the idea of us having this conversation in Wyoming, oxymoronic to some folks.
I think it's great.
Yeah, like a honest politician or a really tall midget or a good Christian slave owner.
There's a few honest politicians. I've worked with a few.
Okay.
And nobody's more cynical about politicians than political science instructors. But I've been schooled. I have been schooled. I've had to eat my words in some cases. I think I'm really honored actually to be having this discussion here. It's it's one thing to have this discussion in Chicago where King visited and he lived for a year. And it's another thing to have this discussion in an area where it may not have been as salient a thing, or where there may be more people who might be inclined to oppose this fuller legacy of his. So I'm very, very happy to be talking about this here. And I was saying, I'm really, really happy that you're holding this book up, because even though it is back in publication and it's easy to find now, and it's affordable, I'm still not sure how much attention it's getting compared to Why We Can't Wait. And I'm not trying to trash that book. It's a very good book. But it's like bookends of his evolution, right? If you really want to understand King's evolution and his full path of his thought over time, over this very short but intense period of his leadership. I mean, let's remember, he was only in a position of leadership for 13 years. And so he had this very compressed evolution. You can't fully understand it without reading all or part of Where Do We Go From Here. And you just don't see, you still don't see it come up as often. So that's why when I saw your email, I was like super happy to talk about it, because the more I think people talk about this book and engage this book, the better, especially now. That doesn't mean that everybody's going to be won over by it. And part of me is not even about winning people over by this, but it's really about just putting the facts out there that he was not this patron saint of passivity, that he was not complacent, and that he was absolutely not a patron saint of colorblindness, if colorblindness is going to be used to stop at tokenism, or if it's going to be used to oppose race-conscious remedies. And that's the most important thing. You just can't invoke him.
Well, the thought was teaching his last book first would give a different kind of view, if you will, a more clear view. By the time we get back to the I Have a Dream speech, you'll have a different understanding by his content. Right. So I haven't seen Cindy. So Doc, we thank you so much. Okay. So we appreciate you.
And thank you. And I know I still owe you paperwork, so I might need you to walk me through that, but thank you. Thank you for staying, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Sure. And I hate that. Okay, I hate it.
And I'm sorry about the camera thing here. I don't know what's going on. Because I've been Zooming successfully from here for the past month and a half, so I'm not quite sure.
Thank you, Dr. Rivers. We appreciate you.
All right, you all have a great day. Oh, wait, I see a question. Just so you'll know, her chat is disabled.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you. And I hope you all have some good discussions afterwards.
We will. Thank you so much. I'll talk to you soon.
Take care. All right. Okay. Bye-bye.